Daniel Jeremiah, welcome back to Sports Spectrum. It's been about 4 years, man. How are you?
Oh my goodness. It's been 4 years. This is what
2018.
happens. This is what happens when we start getting older, Jason, is like you start losing track of years, and I think months, and now you tell me 4 years. Come on, man. Although I will say this to as we get started here, if you're wondering what it's like to get older, if you're watching or listening, when you have to go stay at a hotel for work and you pack your heating pad, then you know that you are officially 44 years of age.
Oh my gosh. Well, I got you by 4 years. I'm 48.
Okay.
And I haven't packed the heating pad yet, but let's just put it this way. I stopped playing basketball because the pain was so unbearable the next morning, and I wasn't even hurt. Let's just put it that way.
So. Well, I popped my Achilles about 7 years ago, and that officially ended my basketball days, which was a bummer because it's such great exercise and it's actually enjoyable versus getting on a treadmill or a bike and just being miserable.
Daniel, I go for walks now. That's what I do.
See, heating pads, walks. That's who we are. I've accepted it. I've just accepted it.
Seriously. The NFL draft, of course, this weekend. I'm coming up here Thursday night, April 28th, Friday the 29th, Saturday the 30th on NFL Network. What number NFL draft is this for you? You know,
so with the network, with NFL Network, it's my 10th. So it'll be my 10th draft. I think 13 was my first one. But I started scouting in 03 was my first draft. So gosh, it's like you look up, and then even before that and probably was when we first met, when I was helping Mort answer phones when I was still in college. That was like 1998.
Yeah.
So I was going to the draft with Mort and answering his phone. So now you start getting up to like, oh my goodness, I've been involved in this in some capacity for 25 years. It's crazy.
Well, we first met, had to be 2011 or 12. I think it was even earlier when you had came back and kind of did the first take on ESPN before you took that opportunity with NFL Network. And it's obviously been great for you and worked out. Gosh, number 10 for NFL Network. That's so great.
Isn't that crazy?
How many notes and scouting material? This isn't actually the right question. You have a lot of notes and scouting material. How many players are those notes and scouting material on? Do you have a certain number that you've gotten to at this point?
So I get to 400. That's my number. And if you wanted to, and I know some guys do it, and God bless them for it, that can go on forever. I mean, you could watch 700 guys if you wanted. But to me, there's 250 plus guys that get picked every year. 400, I sleep well at night knowing I've got the 400. And on average, I would say, last year I think was different because we didn't have a combine. And so there was limited physicals. So the guys who you kind of knew who had physicals. And so there was less pop-up guys. We call them ghosts, like guys who don't show up at all-star games or the combine, and they still get picked. So last year, I think maybe three guys got drafted that I hadn't studied. And I'd say in most years, you're probably looking at more like 8 or 9. So, and I always put my hands up and just try and be honest with everybody. I'm like, hey, I watched 400 guys. This guy was not one of those 400. So I know as much about him as you do. So I'm not going to try and fake my way through that, but that's usually my target.
Do you remember, you mentioned the first NFL draft that you covered was 98 when you were in college helping Mort?
It was around that time. So I would have been a sophomore or junior. I answered his phones. So if, and this kind of dates us too, right? So this is almost like early cell phone days. Yeah. So there was actually, Mort had a landline right off to the side of the set at Radio City Music Hall. No, that would have been Madison Square Garden. That's where the draft was. So he would be on set, on air, and then I had this hard line that GMs would call and want to get information and trade information. So I would just literally Chris Mortensen's phone, and they're like, "Who is this?" My name's Daniel. I'm answering his phones. He's on the air. What can I relay? So he'd like, hey, I want to know what's going on with this player or that player. Write it on a little 3x5 card. As soon as a commercial, boom, give him the note. He'd write down a response. If he could call the guy, he would call him from the set. If not, he'd give me the information. I'd go back and call the guy. So I was just like this go-between, like maybe a draft courier, so to speak, of information. So, and I'm a college kid. I love the draft. It was a lot of fun.
I think about, the role that Ian has and Adam has with ESPN and NFL Network on breaking stories, and even more, and the, connection with technology and the way that you get information. you were grinding if you were doing that pre-cell phone, right? Like you
Oh
just described
gosh.
that as a landline. How are you getting
Yeah.
that information out and breaking it? And Mort was the guy in
Yeah.
the 90s as he's breaking stories with ESPN. What a different time.
It's totally different. If you talk about how long you've been doing this and how things have changed. So from my scouting role, so I got started in '03. When I started scouting, we were using beta tapes to watch players. So beta tapes, which
Yeah.
you could only get a half of a game on one beta tape. So, and that's the offense. So if I wanted to watch a whole game and watch the prospects and on both sides of the ball, that's 4 tapes. So it was just like that was, or no, sorry, it would just be 2 tapes. You have the first half, second half, and you watch each team that way. But so it was 2 tapes for one game, and you'd go on the road. So I'm getting ready to go on the road, but I want to get some tape done on the side. You would load up your box, pack as many tapes in there as you could, ship them to the first hotel you're going to be staying at. So then you had your big beta deck, which you carried in a suitcase, which think about now, especially the way air travel's changed post 9/11. You're carrying this box with this equipment in it. It looks very suspicious. So you'd have to lug that thing around.
Yeah.
And so you'd get to your first place. So every night you're going to a different hotel to go to a different school. So every night I'm having to take this box, load this huge, heavy box of beta tapes into my trunk. Then I got to go back, get this case that has all the beta deck with all the cords that I need for that, lug that in. And you're having to do that night after night after night. And then it went from that to, man, you're not going to believe this. We have them on DVDs. So I was like, this is a godsend. This is unbelievable. So you carry around those huge Case Logics. Remember the Case Logics for your CDs?
Yeah.
So, and that would be one game on one disc. So then you travel with this big thing. And then it was like, this is amazing. Then it progressed during my time to now we have a big drive. So you'd carry the big drive, have all that video, but at least it's just one thing you're carrying. Heavy, but a big drive. That was big. Then the drives got smaller. And it was like, oh, I'm spoiled. And to eventually, at the very end of my time in 2012, it wasn't there yet, but they were getting to the cloud-based stuff where it's all on your laptop. So I tell all these young scouts that I see, you guys are so spoiled. You have no idea.
The same with people in broadcasting and media too. If they only knew what it was like
splicing tape.
I
was you think they know about that?
Yes. The first thing I ever learned, Daniel, in college was how to splice a reel-to-reel machine in the 90s. Come on.
I did the same thing. I interned at a radio station in San Diego when I was in high school. So it would have been early days of college. So I would come home in the summers. They carried the Padre games. And so I would go to the radio station at night. Didn't pay me $1, by the way, just as a total intern. Yeah. And you'd listen to the game, hear the highlight. You'd have to go to the reel, splice it, cut it, make the cartridge. I mean, think about how old we are, like that. Nobody knows about that stuff.
I hope there's some listeners who are over 50 that are hearing this and relating to it, because it does make us feel old for sure, Daniel. You mentioned that opportunity to answer Mort's calls. And I remember there was this moment 2 years ago at the NFL draft, which was the strangest, but most unique and maybe fulfilling, if that makes even sense, time to be a sports fan with everything that was unknown with COVID going on. And ESPN and NFL Network kind of merged. Talent was on different networks, which was a really neat thing to watch. But it gave this opportunity, and I think it was on day 3 when they did it, with you and Mort on the same screen, and you had this opportunity to kind of publicly tell the story and thank him. What did that mean to you? That had to be a really neat thing, because I know you and Mort are still close, and he's talked about you multiple times on this podcast. But for you to be able to publicly acknowledge that on the draft, on the NFL draft, when there's a lot of eyeballs watching.
Yeah, I was so thankful for that opportunity, because they had planned, and it was a weird year, like you mentioned. So I'm here at the NFL Network, and then I'm joining the ESPN team for this broadcast. So it's ESPN producers, a lot of ESPN talent, and then I'm kind of in the mix there. So I'm just trying to I'm going to be a polite guest. Whatever you guys want me to do, I'll do. Whatever you need me to do, I'll do. But really, it was a cool thing to see these two companies come together to pull this thing off. Yes. But I knew they were going to do something to honor Mort, and they had a plan, and I did not, I was, hey, if it involves me, I would love to publicly thank him for what he's done for me, but it was their call. I didn't push anything. So, as on the TV thing, so I'm not on air. and they get in my ear and say, as they're doing the Mort thing, they say, "Hey, do you want to say anything?" And so you're looking at yes, like I want to say something. So there was it wasn't like I knew the day before or an hour before. It was literally 20 seconds before. So you have nothing really planned, but it was just, man, this is going to be a great opportunity to me to, like you said, publicly acknowledge him and thank him, because it was a total God thing how we came together. He listened to my dad on the radio. It was the Super Bowl that year was the Packers and the Broncos. It was the John Elway win in San Diego. I think maybe 97. I think it was maybe that Super Bowl.
Yeah, 97 season. Yep.
So in that time, it was 2 years or 2 weeks for the gap between the championship games and the Super Bowl. So I went to church during that time, to my dad's church, and then I came home for lunch, and Chris Mortensen's in our house, and I'm like, what is going on here? My dad had never met him before. Mort just he'd listened to my dad for years. He wanted to go to see him speak at the church. So after the service, he went up and introduced himself to my dad, and my dad's a huge sports fan. So my dad invited him up to lunch. So that's how I met him there all the way back in 1997. And then from that, he went and saw me play in college a couple times. He then, as we kind of discussed, invited me up to Bristol to watch some shows and had me help him with the draft, and just introduced me into this whole world that I didn't know anything about, but I was very passionate about. And he just opened doors. God used him, just opened so many doors for me in my career. And I wanted to just kind of acknowledge not only what you've done for me professionally, but just the friendship that we have. Who gets a chance? Like how blessed you are to be able to get a chance to be able to publicly acknowledge somebody and what they've done, because he's a special guy.
Very special. It's funny. I met Mort years ago when I first started at ESPN, but it wasn't until one day at my church here in Bristol, Connecticut at Hillside, when Mort showed up one day. And I said, "Mort, what are you doing here at Hillside?" And it was just this connection. I didn't know a lot about his faith until I saw him walk in my church. And I said, "Well, let's chat." And it really impacted me to watch him, kind of knowing he was a follower of Christ and knowing he was a guy that loves the Lord. And again, he shared his testimony on this show. But for you, obviously he's listening to your dad. So that's a door open right there to know that he's at least interested in hearing, a preacher share the gospel. But what has his faith been and meant to you being in a business like this, which can be a tough business to be in?
Yeah, it's been, again, you talk about phrases like showing somebody the ropes. And obviously you want to emulate Christ in all that you do. And there's some areas and professions where I think it's easier than others to do that. And so he's a great example of, we've talked about things, but more than anything else, you just, as a young person, it's a great lesson, right? People are going to pay attention to what you do more than what you say. Yeah. So you see him in those environments, see how he handles himself. And more importantly, for me, it was cool to see how respected he was for his faith, by the people he worked with and by his colleagues. So that was it was a tremendous example for me. And we talk about stuff. We still talk multiple times a week. And so the conversations, we might go 4 conversations without really talking much about football. And then we might go 4 conversations without talking much about faith. It's just a very cool relationship. But I know, like you said, it's different. It's hard to explain it. It's hard to put words on it. And I'm sure there's lawyers would say the same thing. Doctors would say the same thing. Yeah. But you live it's a secular world. It's a secular environment. You want to make sure that you're doing the right things. And I think it's great to have an example of somebody, especially that's older, that's done it, that's been there. It's really a cool thing.
Daniel Jeremiah is our guest here on Sports Spectrum. He'll be a part of NFL Network's draft coverage beginning Thursday night, April 28th. Can't wait for the NFL draft. It's crazy that we're here for another NFL draft. When the draft ends, how long is your vacation? Like, is that the moment when you say, okay, I'll see you in 2 months? What is that like for you when it's over? Because it really starts once college and the NFL begin in the late summer, and it goes to right about now.
I'm a teacher. That's what I tell everybody. I'm basically live the life of a teacher. Where that is my final exam is the NFL draft. And once I take finals, I get a little bit of a blow. So they're great. I'll do a, kind of a week's worth of shows right after the draft as we're kind of recapping everything. But then they're pretty cool about giving me, 2 to 3 weeks where I'm just totally in the clear, off, no podcast, nothing. And then I'll start easing back in, doing some podcasts here or there, and kind of get that stuff rolling until we get to, training camp in July. And then now you're on the training camp tour, and it's just like this calendar cycle that just kind of continues and repeats itself. But the weird thing is, I finish with the draft here. It's early May. Well, my kids don't get done with school for another month. So I always get asked, "Oh man, you must go on a great vacation once the draft ends." I'm like, by myself? No, my kids are still in school. I got to wait till they're freed up to go. So it's a lot of catching up on sleep more than anything else.
That's great. And hopefully you get some good time alone and some time to actually go on a vacation, even if it's right at that tail end of your vacation time with your kids having some extra time too.
One of the things, Jason, we've done the last couple of years, and I always love catching up with you because I love getting your thoughts on this stuff too.
Yeah.
But my wife and I have found tremendous value in these little one-day getaways, so, and we're fortunate where we live. There's cool places that you can go in San Diego and, Orange County, different beach areas. And it's like, hey, you're going hard. You're working really hard during the week. And then you've got games. If you find a gap in the schedule where the kids don't have games or we have time, like, let's just get one day, go, be together and spend time with each other, invest in each other. And that's something we've only started doing the last couple of years. Man, I think I would encourage anybody out there, if you're in kind of a grind mode in your profession, carve out those days, because you'd be amazed what a recharge that is, just having that one day to get away.
Yeah, even if it's an overnight, or even if it's just like a date for the day, right? Like when you go somewhere, maybe you go shopping, you get dinner, you spend some time together. It does a world of good for your marriage. Because I was going to ask you about that with marriage, and it's a common topic that a lot of our guests, or I should say a lot of our audience, likes to hear about, is how do you stay connected with your wife in a business like this, in a grind like this, when you're going, especially between August or July and the end of April into early May. But how do you find time and manage to do that? And I'm sure there's lessons that you've learned over the years before, when you first started, compared to where you are now.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things that have been cool for us and we should have done this earlier, and it's my fault we didn't do it earlier, but we've done a pretty good job for the most part over the last couple of years of, like, Fridays being our lunch. That's our lunch day. So that's our lunch date. It's harder in the evening, is when the kids are involved in activities, to get that time. So we've done pretty good about blocking off those Fridays and being able to have those lunch dates. And then the other thing, one of my favorite parts of the day is just, you get up, I'll take the kids to school and then get back home. And usually a lot of my stuff starts, shows and meetings, usually about 10 o'clock. So there's still a little gap there. So get the kids to school, come home, sit on the couch. We have our coffee and just kind of catch up and connect at that point in time. But it would be easy. It'd be really easy to just kind of be two, ships passing the night and justify it because you've got a heavy workload or there's a lot going on. But those connections, especially those daily, coffee connections or those Friday lunches, I think that's huge.
What about your relationship with the Lord, right? It's easy to talk about that, but what about your relationship during this grind? Because I hate to say it, fitting God's time with God into the schedule, it sounds so horrible to say when you've proclaimed the Lord as your savior and trying to live a life of faith. But it really becomes that. Is there an intentionality for you during the season, or rhythm, disciplines, whatever that looks like, to stay in tune with your walk with the Lord?
Yeah, I would say the hardest thing for me, and I don't know what the right answer is, but the hardest thing for me is that my Sundays are spoken for in the fall. And, so that's brutal. And I wish there was a way to kind of be able to exist in both those realms. It's just not possible. So that's the hard part. One of the things I've learned is that, if you can carve out your daily time, is huge, but then there's also ways where technology comes in huge. When you're on the road, being able to plug into services online, be able to, stay involved that way. I have a commute, from here to SoFi Stadium where the Chargers play, where I do their games. It's an hour and 20 minutes. So Sunday morning, that's my service. I get in there, I've got either a podcast or you can listen to a live service, and that's how you get connected that way. Yeah. There's always more, there's always that evaluation of, okay, from a everyday standpoint, man, I need to be better. I need to be more consistent, because you notice it when you're not in it, when your prayer life's not where it needs to be, when you're not in the word as much as you need to be. It's noticeable, and I think you brought up a great point. it sounds so terrible when you say it. Like, I need to fit in God. I need to fit in my prayer life. I need to fit in time for me to get into the word. And it's like, no, you can drift into that area where you start to think like that. And it's a great reminder that, hey, you've got to be intentional. That's the word that you used. I love that word. You've got to intentionally schedule that like you would schedule, a production meeting. So I think that's a challenge. You're still trying to grow, on a daily basis, on a yearly basis, to make sure you don't, get away from that.
And even though it's crazy, prep time for the draft, is it a little different when there's not games on Sundays? So it allows you to kind of form a natural, more normal
More rhythms.
lifestyle, more rhythm.
Yeah. There's definitely more rhythm. And it's much easier. It just is, because you can kind of get into that, into that rhythm. It's a challenge that I think a lot of people have, whatever job you might have that might, have you working on that day, is to be able to get into a different rhythm. Like, you can't just say, well, got to work on that day, so that's out. No, there's ways you just got to be intentional about it and build that in. But it is infinitely easier once the season ends, no doubt.
What's the biggest difference between Daniel Jeremiah, the follower of Christ, when he was, I don't know, 20, when you were in college or whatever, and that Daniel Jeremiah now? Because I would even venture to say that question go back to when you were a little kid, because you grew up with a dad who was and is a pastor who shares the gospel, who is in church every week. What's the biggest difference between that young version of Daniel and the man of faith now?
I would say hopefully less selfish, I think especially with kids, my wife is great about this. She brings this up all the time, that the more you realize it's not about you. I mean, the Bible's very clear on that, right? So the more you get outside of yourself and realize, hey, and I admire her so much for this, because every day she wakes up, how can I bless somebody? How can I encourage somebody? And it's not waking up in the day and say, what does the world have for me today? What does God have for me today? So, you know what? God's going to use me today. I'm going to go out and I'm going to encourage people. I'm going to go in the workplace and I'm going to have a smile on my face. I'm not going to complain. And I'm going to try and be somebody who listens. It doesn't just talk. Those are things I think when you're younger, it's more about you, it just is the way it is. And I think that you get to an age, hopefully a maturity level with Christ, and you realize that's not how it was modeled for us. It's a life of service. And it's amazing is when you take the focus off yourself, you'd be surprised how much happier you are.
Does the opportunity to talk to people about the Lord come because of what your dad does, and just people naturally asking you about you and your family and what about your parents? Does that create a unique, I guess, conversation that you could have that others might not be able to have, and whether it's in the workplace or just when you're out and about?
One of the things that's been cool, and this is totally how God works, is that I've never been, really in your face or in that way. But
Sure.
what I've done is I've never hidden from it. And I've always been, I love to talk about it. If you have a question, let's have those conversations. And what I've learned, and even going back to when I was in college, I remember getting made fun of. Like, I remember being on the football team at Northeast Louisiana, and they had some type of a event on campus, and it was I don't know who put it on or whatever, but they gave out condoms to everybody. Well, I come into my locker, and they've decorated my whole locker with condoms, because they're like, here's the Christian guy. Like, I'm going to, they're giving me a hard time. I just kind of roll my eyes, whatever. But the funny thing is, the guys that would do that, one of them in particular, had something really kind of tough go on in his life, like, 4 or 5 months later. And he came to me and he wanted to talk to me about it and wanted to, get my thoughts on, want me to pray with him and all these kind of things. And I thought, that's such a God. It's like a wink. That's just like a wink from God, that they're paying attention and they know you're somebody that they go to when things aren't going well. And I've been fortunate enough to have those conversations over, so many years. And those are the fun ones. That's what you're grateful for, because you go, I don't know if people are paying attention, or if they, is this the way I try and live my life? Is that turn off? Yeah. And then you get to have God opens those doors for you, so that's been pretty cool.
Daniel Jeremiah has been our guest here on Sports Spectrum. Again, the NFL Network coverage begins Thursday night. Can't wait. April 28th, 8 p.m. Eastern on NFL Network, and then all throughout the weekend as you watch the NFL draft unfold. I want to ask you 2 quick questions about the draft. Yeah. Is there a prediction that you made on the draft, because it's a prediction or it's a guess, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, when you do these mock drafts, that stands out as a yes, we nailed that one. And it could even be not a certain player going to a certain team, but a certain player being really good. And you
Yeah.
saw it, and maybe others didn't quite see it. Is there a player over the last decade that comes to mind that you think of?
Yeah, I mean, there's several. I mean, last year, we just go back to last year was an interesting one because I think, Rashawn Slater from Northwestern was kind of my top offensive lineman through the whole process, and he wasn't as heralded, going to the beginning of the process, and you had, so that was one where he didn't end up being the first one picked, but he's all pro or whatever as a rookie. So you feel good about that. But I'll tell you, man, I could tell you 500 that I got the other way. Those are the ones you
ask
remember.
Is there one from
Oh
the
my
other
gosh.
side that you
Oh
just
my
shake your head
gosh.
at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a million of them. I can go back to when I was scouting with a guy like Aaron Curry, who the Seattle Seahawks took, who did not work out well.
Yeah.
Greg Robinson, who I liked, the offensive lineman at Auburn, busted with the Rams. I mean, there's a million of them. And one of the things that you kind of always go back and you evaluate. I like to do it over this free time I get after the draft, is go back like 3 or 4 drafts and go through my whole list and see, okay, it's simple. It's on an Excel spreadsheet. Red for the guys that at least on the surface look like they were wrong evaluation, and then kind of green for the ones that are right. I don't even care about the ones that are right. I just go back and study the ones that were wrong. And 9 times out of 10, it's not the ability that you missed. There's something in terms of the makeup or kind of the desire, the work ethic. That ends up being the issue more times than not, is that you didn't evaluate the person properly. Maybe the player, but you got the person wrong. But yeah, the bad ones, oh my gosh, they stick out a lot more than the good ones, I can promise you.
And evaluating the person is hard because you're probably not talking to 400 players. Maybe you are, but I mean, it's really hard to talk to all of these guys and kind of get a good read on them, right?
One of the things I've tried to do more of the last couple of years is you get a chance to meet a lot of these kids, and you get a chance to meet the agents. And so, and agents are always going to try and pump up their guys and think that somehow that you're going to help them through this process. And I've been pretty consistent with them. They know I don't really play that game. But what I can do is use quality relationships that you develop with agents to get access to the kids. And so what I'll do is I'll say, hey, if he has time, you've got this first round receiver, can you, if he'd be okay with it, not on the air, not recording anything, I just want to talk to him for 15 minutes. And they're pretty cool about it. And they'll let me do that. And a lot of times I'll get a cool nugget or a cool story that I can share on the draft, which kind of breaks up the monotony of just player evaluation after player evaluation. You get to learn about the kids. But I found that in 15 minutes, just in that one-on-one conversation, you can learn a lot about somebody. And hopefully it helps you have a little bit better batting average.
And there's probably been some of those calls that you get off and you were like, oh boy, maybe I need to rethink about my evaluation here.
You know what, I was just talking to a GM about this the other day. One of my biggest takeaways, because we always would share information about, like, give me good questions. Like, what are good questions that can get you good answers? Right. And then one of the things that I've learned and I paid attention to over the last couple of years is I pay attention to the guys who are asking you questions, because curiosity is huge. Because it's hard to if you look at somebody, and I believe humility is a huge aspect of being successful in life. Like, take even the Christian component out of it. If you're humble, you're acknowledging you don't know everything, which means you have a growth mindset and you're trying to learn and get better. If you have all the answers and you're arrogant, you are what you are. You've hit your head on the ceiling. You're not getting better. So I've just found the relationship between humility and curiosity has been pretty telling. And so the guys that ask you, hey, you were around Ed Reed, what was his, how did he prepare? What did he do? Do you know, like, how he watched tape, or what was his practice habits, or this, that, or the other? You were around Joe Thomas, like, he was a great tackle, these types of things. And those kids that ask you all those questions, 9 times out of 10, they end up being the really good players.
Yeah. Showing ambition. Who's the one guy outside of, the top 5 or 10 that know that we should pay attention to this week? Who's one guy that stands out that may be a late first day or a second day guy that you want us to focus on?
I think, like, Trent McDuffie's a corner from Washington who is a pro. Like, he is a pro's pro. They say he could teach you the defense as well as the coaches could at Washington. So he's not the biggest guy in the world, but he's extremely tough. He's a really fast kid, and he's just you talk about wiring and how you're made up and all that. It's off the charts. So those are fairway picks to me. I don't care how far you're hitting it, but that thing is dead in the middle of the fairway. So you're going to be feeling good about yourself. You'll sleep well the night after you pick a guy like that.
That's good. Last question, my friend. And we're excited about the NFL draft. We really are. I'm watching you on there. What's the Lord showing you and teaching you today? And that's the question we ask usually to close out this podcast with all of our guests. He teaches us something new every day. You're a couple days away from the draft. What's he kind of teaching you right now?
Be anxious for nothing, like that. That's the whole thing. The connection between, being anxious and anxiety and prayer, like it's spelled out in the Bible. You go to Philippians, you can find it, but that's the answer. Like that is the answer. You start feeling anxious, man, I've got all this guys to watch. I've got all this information to try and digest, and it's a lot going on. And I found, if you find yourself feeling that, boom, you just get yourself right into prayer. And then that's like the elixir for that. So that's what's been pretty cool.
That's great. He is Daniel Jeremiah. Again, Thursday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, April 28th, NFL Network. The NFL Draft 2022 is upon us, and Daniel will be a big part of that. Thanks for joining us, buddy. Really appreciate catching up again, and hopefully we'll do it again soon.
I appreciate you, and have me on after the Padres win the World Series so I can publicly thank God for that happening.
Count it. Lock it in. Let's put it that way. You got it. Thanks, man.
Thanks, brother. Good to see you, man.